It was a quiet evening, the kind of evening when the air feels heavy but peaceful, and the streets are almost empty except for the soft hum of cars passing by every now and then. The man behind the wheel of a modest silver sedan sat upright, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, his eyes steady on the road. His name was Harold Jameson, and though most people who saw him would think he was just another elderly gentleman driving home, there was much more to him than met the eye. Harold was a man in his 70s, his hair silver and neatly brushed back, his glasses resting low on his nose. He moved with the patience and dignity of someone who had lived through many seasons of life. To a stranger, he looked ordinary, perhaps a retired teacher or a grandfather heading home after a family gathering. But Harold Jameson carried with him a weighty responsibility that very few in the country ever experienced. He was a Supreme Court judge, a man who had spent his career interpreting laws and making decisions that shaped the future of countless people. That night, however, Harold wasn't thinking about legal cases or courtrooms. He was thinking about the community event he had just attended. It was a small gathering in the town hall where local leaders and residents came together to talk about education and youth opportunities. Harold had been invited as a guest speaker. Despite his age, he enjoyed speaking to young people, reminding them that their voices mattered and that no dream was too far away if they worked for it. He had shared stories from his own journey, about how he had grown up in a time when opportunities were not easily given, and how he had fought through barriers to get an education and eventually serve on the highest court in the land. Driving home now, he felt content. The evening had been fulfilling, and the smiles he saw on the faces of young students still warmed his heart. His car rolled down the road slowly, not because it was weak. It ran smoothly even after years of use, but because Harold never rushed. He had learned long ago that patience was not only a virtue in courtrooms, but also in life. He enjoyed the ride, the stillness of the night, and the calm that came with knowing he had done his part to inspire others. The neighborhood he was driving through was quiet and neat. Houses stood side by side with trimmed lawns and glowing porch lights. Trees lined the sidewalks, their branches swaying slightly in the evening breeze. Harold often passed through this area because it was the quickest route to his own home on the outskirts of town. It was a place he liked to drive through, not because of the fancy homes or the quiet streets, but because it reminded him of how much the world had changed since his youth. There had been a time when neighborhoods like this were closed off to people like him, but now he could drive freely, respected and accomplished. As he adjusted his glasses and turned the wheel gently, Harold thought about the simple blessings in his life. His wife had passed a few years ago, and though he missed her dearly, he often smiled when he remembered her laughter. His children were grown and had families of their own, busy with their careers and raising children. He knew they worried about him sometimes, telling him to slow down, to take more rest, but Harold believed that staying active was what kept him strong. He had no intention of sitting still when there was still work to be done. While his car moved steadily forward, his mind drifted back to the early days of his career. He had once been a young lawyer, fresh out of law school, eager to prove himself in a world that wasn't always welcoming. He had faced doubts, dismissive words, and many obstacles, but he had never let bitterness take root. Instead, he used each challenge as a stepping stone, each setback as a lesson. That determination had carried him forward, one case at a time, until he eventually earned a seat on the state's Supreme Court. Despite his achievements, Harold remained humble. He never sought attention, never flaunted his title. In fact, he preferred the quiet moments, reading in his study, speaking at community events, or driving home on nights like this one. To him, greatness wasn't about recognition. It was about service, and he had dedicated his life to serving others, whether through the law or through personal acts of kindness. As the car approached a stretch of road with fewer houses and dimmer streetlights, Harold turned on his headlights fully. The beams lit up the asphalt ahead, revealing a long, straight road with hardly another vehicle in sight. It was the kind of road that made him relax even more. He adjusted the radio, letting a soft tune fill the car. Music had always been his companion on drives, classical pieces that reminded him of his late wife's love for the piano. Every so often, he glanced at the rearview mirror, a habit he had developed over decades of careful driving. Tonight, the mirror showed nothing but darkness behind him, with only a faint glow of a faraway streetlight. He smiled faintly, thinking about how peaceful the ride was. He didn't know at that very moment that this peaceful drive would soon be interrupted, and that a simple trip home would turn into a moment that revealed more about people and justice than any courtroom ever had. For now, though Harold was simply a man in his car, his hands steady on the wheel, his heart at ease. His life story carried chapters of struggle, triumph, and wisdom, but in the quiet of that evening, all he wanted was to make it home safely, pour himself a cup of tea, and perhaps write a few notes about the speech he had given earlier. He thought about the young boy who had approached him after the event, eyes shining with hope, telling him he wanted to become a lawyer someday. Harold had encouraged him, reminding him that the road would not always be easy, but that perseverance was stronger than doubt. It was moments like that which kept Harold going. Even at his age, he felt a responsibility to light the path for others, just as mentors once did for him. The sedan hummed along, and Harold tapped his fingers gently on the steering wheel in rhythm with the music. He didn't notice the faint glow of headlights appearing far behind him. They were still too distant to catch his attention. For now the world felt safe, calm, and kind. What Harold couldn't have known was that those headlights belonged to a police car. The officer inside had noticed his vehicle and, without real reason, had decided to follow. In just a few minutes, the calm of Harold's evening drive would be broken by flashing blue lights and the sound of a siren. But that part of the story was still ahead. For now, Harold's journey continued, his heart full of peace, unaware of the lesson he was about to teach. Not in a courtroom, but on the side of a quiet road. The steady calm of Harold Jamison's evening drive began to change when he noticed a faint flicker of light reflecting in his rearview mirror. At first it was nothing unusual, just a pair of headlights coming up behind him. He continued driving, at the same gentle pace, humming softly to the tune on his radio. But a moment later the glow grew brighter, sharper, and unmistakably close. Then came the sound, short, piercing, impossible to ignore. A siren. Harold's eyes shifted to the mirror again, and there they were, flashing blue and red lights cutting through the night. For a brief second he wondered if there was an emergency ahead, maybe an accident he hadn't noticed. But when the police car stayed right on his tail, his heart sank with realization. The lights were for him. He slowed his car, signaled, and carefully pulled over to the side of the road. His movements were steady, calm, the same way he had always approached unexpected moments in life. He put the car in park, switched off the radio, and rolled his window halfway down. The cool evening air drifted inside as he rested both hands lightly on the steering wheel, a gesture of cooperation and patience. Inside, though, Harold felt a small tug of unease. He had been in many situations during his career, heated courtrooms, tough negotiations, challenging discussions, but something about being stopped alone at night always carried a certain weight. Still, he told himself to remain composed. He was not a man who lived with fear. Through the side mirror, he caught sight of the officer stepping out of the patrol car. The young man walked briskly toward him, flashlight in hand, his shoulders squared as if ready for confrontation. Harold could almost sense the tone even before the first word was spoken. "License and registration," the officer said firmly, shining the light into the car without so much as a greeting. Harold turned his head slowly, his expression calm. "Good evening, officer," he replied, his voice gentle and even. He moved carefully toward the glove compartment to retrieve his registration, then to his wallet for his driver's license. He handed them over with steady hands, his eyes meeting, the officer's briefly before returning to the steering wheel. The officer barely glanced at the documents before speaking again. "What are you doing in this neighborhood tonight?" The words carried a certain sharpness, a questioning tone that suggested suspicion rather than genuine curiosity. Harold's brow lifted slightly. He had been asked many questions in his life, by lawyers, by jurors, by reporters, but this one carried a different edge. He chose his response carefully, keeping his tone polite. "I'm driving home, officer. I attended an event in town and this road happens to be on my way." The officer narrowed his eyes as if searching for something more in Harold's answer. His flashlight beam lingered across the inside of the car, passing over the dashboard, the seats, and finally back to Harold's face. "You live around here?" the officer asked. Harold nodded. "Not far from here, on the other side of the highway." The young officer shifted his weight, still holding the documents. His stance remained rigid, his expression unreadable. Harold could feel the tension in the air, though he kept his breathing steady. He had learned long ago that sometimes silence was more powerful than words. Moments passed before the officer spoke again. "Do you know how fast you were going?" Harold tilted his head slightly, remembering the stretch of road behind him. He had been careful, as always, not exceeding the speed limit. "I believe I was within the limit, officer. I tend to drive cautiously." The officer's lips tightened, almost as if unsatisfied with the calmness of the reply. He scribbled something on a notepad, though it seemed more out of habit than necessity. Harold watched quietly, his thoughts steady. He had encountered countless young professionals eager to assert themselves, eager to be taken seriously. This officer was no different, yet Harold could not ignore the way the questions had been framed. Not about speed, not about a broken light, but about why he was in the neighborhood. It was a subtle but telling detail, one Harold noted silently in his mind. The officer leaned slightly closer, resting his hand on the car door. "You sure you're not lost? People don't usually take this road if they don't live here." Harold looked at him steadily, his voice still measured. "I assure you, officer, I know where I'm going." The silence that followed stretched long. The officer seemed almost unsettled by Harold's calm presence, as if he had expected nervousness or excuses. Instead, Harold remained composed, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, his demeanor unshaken. For Harold, this was not the first time life had tested his patience. He had been challenged in far more difficult circumstances, moments where decisions carried consequences for thousands of people. Compared to that, this stop was but a ripple in the pond. Yet he also knew that sometimes the smallest ripples revealed the deepest truths. The officer tapped his pen against the notepad, then glanced again at the license in his hand. He squinted, reading the name slowly. Harold Jameson. The flashlight beam wavered slightly as his lips moved over the words. For a moment, something flickered in his expression, but he quickly masked it with formality. Harold remained silent, watching. He could feel the officer's hesitation, though he didn't press. He had learned long ago that patience often revealed more than confrontation ever could. Finally, the officer straightened up. "Wait here," he said, his tone clipped. He turned and walked back toward his patrol car, still holding Harold's license and registration. As the patrol car door shut and the lights continued to flash, Harold leaned back in his seat. The night air was cooler now, the trees along the roadside swaying gently. He clasped his hands together, his mind calm but reflective. He thought about the countless times he had spoken in courtrooms about fairness, about justice being blind, about the responsibility of those who held authority, and here he was, on the side of a quiet road, living through a moment that tested those very ideals. He wondered, not bitterly but thoughtfully, how often people faced situations like this. Ordinary citizens without titles, without recognition, who might not be given the same chance to remain calm and dignified. It was a sobering thought, one that reminded him why his role in the justice system mattered. The minutes stretched on. Harold could see the faint glow of the officer's computer screen inside the patrol car, the officer typing, checking, searching. He remained patient, his breathing slow, his mind steady. He had no doubt about who he was, no doubt about the truth of his identity. The real question, he thought, was whether this young officer would discover it, and what he would do once he did. The quiet of the road returned, broken only by the distant chirp of crickets and the low hum of the patrol car's engine. Harold sat waiting, not with frustration, but with the calm of a man who had lived long enough to know that sometimes life's greatest lessons came not in grand courtrooms but in simple, unexpected places, like the side of a dimly lit street on an ordinary night. Harold Jameson sat quietly in his car, the steering wheel cool beneath his fingertips, the evening air brushing lightly against his face through the half-rolled window. He had grown used to waiting in his life, waiting for juries to reach decisions, waiting for lawyers to finish long arguments, waiting for truth to come forward. Waiting was nothing new, but tonight the waiting carried a different weight. He glanced in his side mirror. The officer was still in the patrol car, leaning over the computer screen, typing rapidly. From the faint glow inside, Harold could see his face lit by the reflection of the screen. He could imagine what the officer was doing, running his license, checking records, searching for anything that might give reason to extend the stop. Harold was certain there would be nothing unusual to find. His driving record was clean, his license in order, his registration current. The judge folded his hands together in his lap, his mind calm but thoughtful. What he couldn't know was what kind of conclusion the officer would reach. Would he come back with another round of questions? Would he search for a reason to issue a ticket? Or would he simply return his documents and allow him to continue home? Harold had been in enough situations to understand that the outcome often depended less on the law and more on the person enforcing it. The door of the patrol car opened at last. The officer stepped out, his flashlight once again in hand, and approached Harold's sedan. His steps were firm, almost rehearsed. Harold rolled the window down a bit more as the young man arrived at his door. "Mr. Jameson," the officer began, reading the name from the license. "Do you have any reason to be nervous tonight?" Harold looked up, his eyes steady. "No, officer," he said in his calm voice. "I'm simply driving home." The officer's gaze lingered on him as though searching for cracks in the answer, but Harold's tone was as steady as the night air. The officer then shifted the flashlight slightly, letting the beam fall across Harold's suit jacket lying neatly on the passenger seat. "You coming from a meeting?" the officer asked, the tone curious but edged with suspicion. "Yes," Harold answered. "A community event in town. I was invited to speak." The officer's eyebrows lifted slightly, though his face remained guarded. "Speak about what?" Harold met the question with patience. "About education, about opportunities for young people. It's something I care deeply about." The officer paused, tapping the license against his hand. "Mind telling me what you do for a living?" For a moment, Harold considered how to reply. He could easily answer directly, but part of him wanted to see how long this dance of questions would continue. He had spent a lifetime measuring his words, choosing when to reveal more and when to remain quiet. Tonight was no different. "I work in the field of law," Harold said simply, his voice steady but offering no details. The officer's flashlight shifted again, then returned to Harold's face. "Law, huh? Attorney?" "You could say that," Harold replied, still calm, his eyes unwavering. The silence stretched for a moment. The officer seemed unsatisfied with the vagueness but hesitant to press too far. He shifted back a step, then leaned forward slightly, resting his arm on the car door. "You know, people don't usually drive through this area unless they live here. You're sure you're just passing through?" Harold nodded once. "I'm certain. My home is only a few miles from here." The officer studied him for a long moment, as if trying to piece together a puzzle. To Harold, it was clear what was happening. The officer had made assumptions the moment he saw his car, assumptions that had nothing to do with broken laws or unsafe driving. Harold had spent decades in courtrooms reminding others that assumptions could cloud judgment. And here it was, playing out on the side of a road. Instead of frustration, Harold felt something else, resolve. He knew that the way he carried himself in these next minutes could teach a lesson greater than any courtroom ruling. He chose patience, as he always had. The officer finally straightened and handed the documents back, though slowly. His expression softened just slightly, but his tone remained guarded. "All right. Stay safe out here." Harold took the license and registration, placing them carefully back in his wallet and glove compartment. "Thank you, officer," he said politely. His voice carried no bitterness, only calm dignity. The officer lingered a moment longer, as if debating whether to add something more. His lips parted, then closed again. Finally, with a small nod, he turned and walked back to the patrol car. The flashing lights dimmed, then disappeared as the car pulled away, leaving Harold once again in the quiet of the road. Harold sat still for a moment before starting his engine again. The soft hum of the sedan filled the silence, but his thoughts were louder than the sound of the car. He replayed the conversation in his mind, each question, each pause, each look. It was not the first time he had experienced such a moment, and he knew it might not be the last. Yet each time it reminded him why his role mattered, why fairness and justice were not just words written in books, but living principles that shaped people's lives in the most ordinary of places. He adjusted his mirror and pulled back onto the road, the darkness stretching out ahead of him once more. The calm of the night returned, though the memory of the stop lingered in his chest. He thought about the officer, about how youth and inexperience often brought with them a need to prove authority. He wondered whether the officer would reflect on the stop later, whether he would think about the way he had questioned a man who had done nothing wrong. Harold did not dwell on anger. Instead, he allowed himself to hope that perhaps one day encounters like this would be guided more by fairness than suspicion. Hope that the next generation of officers would learn to balance authority with understanding. Hope that the lessons of dignity and patience would spread beyond courtrooms and into everyday life. The road stretched on, and Harold's thoughts shifted back to the students he had spoken to earlier that evening. He pictured the young faces, eager and determined, looking to him for guidance. He imagined their futures, lawyers, teachers, doctors, leaders, and felt a sense of peace knowing that seeds of hope had been planted. Whatever challenges they faced, perhaps they would remember his words, remember the importance of standing tall with dignity, even when the world questioned them. The sedan rolled smoothly through the night, the streetlights passing one by one. Harold's heart felt lighter now. The moment of tension had passed, and though it had tested him, it had not shaken him. He carried with him the strength of experience, the calm of wisdom, and the quiet certainty of a man who knew who he was, regardless of how others saw him. By the time he turned onto the road leading to his neighborhood, the stars were visible above, bright against the dark sky. He slowed the car, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to. He wanted to savor the peace, to let the night close gently around him after a long day. When he finally pulled into his driveway, the porch light greeted him warmly. He parked, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment in the quiet car. He let out a deep breath, not of exhaustion but of reflection. Life had tested him once again, and once again he had answered not with anger but with patience, not with bitterness but with grace. He stepped out of the car, the cool night air wrapping around him. As he walked toward his front door, he carried not only the weight of his own dignity but also the unspoken promise that he would continue to stand for fairness, in courtrooms and beyond, as long as he had breath to speak. Harold Jameson drove the last few miles toward home with a quiet sense of reflection. The evening, which had begun peacefully, had turned into an experience that reminded him of how easily assumptions could shape the way people acted. He had endured the questions and the scrutiny with patience, but he knew that sometimes lessons came in subtle, unexpected ways. Tonight, that lesson was about authority and humility, and he could not help but wonder how it would settle in the officer's mind. As he approached the familiar curve of his neighborhood, the streetlights casting long shadows on the asphalt, a thought crossed his mind. How often did people judge others based on appearance, age, or the vehicle they drove? How many times had he seen justice delayed because assumptions clouded clarity? The irony was not lost on him. A man tasked with upholding justice had just been scrutinized on a dark suburban road simply because he looked ordinary. And yet, it was precisely this ordinary appearance that allowed him to remain calm, to meet the situation with patience rather than confrontation. Harold pulled up slowly to the familiar street where his home awaited. He had lived here for many years, the quiet neighborhood filled with neighbors who nodded politely in passing, lawns neatly kept, and trees that seemed older than the houses themselves. It was the kind of place where one expected evenings to be quiet, routine, and predictable. Tonight, however, would forever be different, not because anything dramatic happened, but because an ordinary interaction had revealed extraordinary truths. The officer had returned to his patrol car, and Harold could imagine him sitting there, still holding the documents, still thinking. Young officers often carried with them a need to assert authority, to demonstrate control, especially when they believed they were in the right. But when the truth was revealed, even if only in a subtle, quiet way, everything changed. Authority that had seemed unquestionable suddenly became fragile, human, and vulnerable to reflection. Harold had driven enough miles in his lifetime to understand that moments of revelation often came quietly, without fanfare. A lesson would be learned, perhaps slowly, perhaps over years, but it would remain. And he trusted that this evening, though seemingly ordinary, would leave a lasting impression on the young officer who had stopped him. As he reached his driveway, Harold eased the car to a stop and turned off the engine. He sat in the quiet car for a moment, letting the cool night air fill the cabin, and thought about the unexpected twists of life. Sometimes one's greatest impact did not come from speeches, rulings, or awards, but from simple moments of presence, patience, and calm dignity. Tonight was one of those moments. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out, feeling the familiar crunch of gravel beneath his shoes. The porch light illuminated the front of his home, warm and welcoming. Yet the memory of the roadside encounter remained vivid. He carried it not as a burden but as a reflection on life and human nature. The young officer had acted as many people acted, guided by assumptions, by preconceived notions, by the visible rather than the known. Yet Harold had remained unshaken, a silent teacher in an unexpected classroom. Inside, his home was quiet. The familiar smells of old books and polished wood greeted him, and he allowed himself to breathe deeply. He placed his briefcase on the side table, loosened his tie, and sank into his favorite armchair by the window. Outside, the night was calm, the neighborhood quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves or distant bark of a dog. Inside, Harold's mind turned again to the officer, to the interaction, to the subtle power of truth. He imagined the officer sitting in the patrol car, thinking back over the stop, the exchange, the calm demeanor of the man he had questioned. Perhaps the officer would replay the events in his mind, wondering what he had missed, questioning why his approach had been met with patience rather than resistance. Harold knew that understanding often came slowly, sometimes only after reflection, and he trusted that the officer's lesson would arrive, just as he had seen lessons arrive in countless lives before. For Harold, the night also became a reflection on his own journey. How many times had he faced situations where his authority, knowledge, or experience had been questioned? How often had he had to navigate delicate moments with dignity and calm, knowing that anger or haste would serve no purpose? Life had taught him that strength was not always shown in dominance or loud declarations, but in quiet, steady confidence and the ability to remain composed when challenged. He thought about the students he had met earlier in the evening, their bright eyes filled with hope, their eagerness to learn. Just like the young officer, they were in the process of discovering the world, forming ideas, assumptions, and judgments. Harold's role, whether in the courtroom or in simple interactions like this evening, had always been to guide, to teach, to illuminate paths with patience rather than force. Tonight had been no different, except the lesson had been mutual. There was a subtle satisfaction in knowing that truth, in its quiet form, had the power to teach even without words. The young officer had seen a man who appeared ordinary, had judged him with suspicion, and had been met with patience and calm instead of anger. In that small but significant moment, a shift had occurred, one that Harold hoped would resonate beyond this night, beyond this street, and perhaps even influence how the officer approached his duties in the future. Harold walked to his study and sat at his desk, opening a notebook. He often wrote reflections, small thoughts that he would later revisit or share with students, colleagues, or friends. Tonight he wrote about patience, humility, and the quiet power of dignity. He reflected on the unexpected ways life revealed truths and how ordinary moments could become extraordinary lessons. He noted that authority was most meaningful when tempered with understanding, and that even the smallest interactions could have lasting impacts. He paused, pen in hand, letting the words settle. Outside, the night was still, and he felt a gentle sense of completion. The roadside encounter had been resolved peacefully, without conflict, without bitterness. And yet it had revealed much about human nature, about assumptions, and about the quiet strength that comes from living a life grounded in patience and fairness. Harold stood and walked to the window, looking out over the neighborhood. The street was calm, the trees swaying gently in the evening breeze. In that moment, he understood something deeply. Influence did not always come from speeches, rulings, or high office. Sometimes it came from presence, from calm, from the quiet dignity with which one met the world. Tonight he had been an example of that truth, whether the officer realized it yet or not. He allowed himself a faint smile. Life had a way of presenting lessons in the most unexpected places. What might have seemed like a minor inconvenience, a traffic stop on a quiet night, had become a lesson in humility, patience, and respect. And that was a lesson worth more than any recognition, any title, or any applause. Finally, Harold walked to the living room, poured himself a cup of tea, and sat back in his chair. The warmth of the cup in his hands matched the quiet satisfaction in his heart. The evening had been unusual, yes, but it had also been enlightening. He had witnessed assumptions at work and had seen the subtle power of truth and patience in response. He reflected once more on his role in the larger picture, the responsibility of guiding others, of standing for justice not only in the courtrooms but in life's everyday moments. Tonight had been a reminder that even in ordinary circumstances one could teach, inspire, and influence with calm strength and measured words. As he sipped his tea, Harold knew that the memory of the evening would stay with him, just as he hoped it would stay with the young officer. It was not about reprimand or embarrassment. It was about revelation, about showing that dignity, patience, and respect could speak louder than suspicion or haste. And perhaps in the quiet of reflection, the officer would come to see it that way too. Harold set the cup down, leaning back in his chair. The house was quiet now, the night stretching outside his windows. He felt a sense of fulfillment, not from triumph, not from being recognized, but from living in alignment with his principles, even when no one was watching, even in moments that might seem small to the rest of the world. The night deepened, stars shining faintly through the clouds. Harold's thoughts drifted to tomorrow, to his work, to the students and people he would continue to guide. But even in that reflection, he carried a quiet satisfaction, knowing that tonight on an ordinary road, he had once again upheld the values he had lived by for decades: patience, dignity, and the unwavering belief that fairness and truth mattered above all else. The night had grown quieter now, the earlier tension on the roadside feeling more like a memory than a reality. Harold Jameson sat in his living room, a soft glow from the lamp illuminating the stacks of papers and books around him. He had poured himself another cup of tea, letting the warmth spread through his hands as he reflected on the evening's events. Though the encounter with the officer had been brief, its impact lingered, a gentle reminder that lessons in life often came in small, unexpected moments. Harold's thoughts returned to the young officer, the man who had approached him with suspicion, questions, and authority. Harold understood why the officer acted as he did. Youth and inexperience often came with a need to prove oneself. Authority, when wielded without reflection, could feel like power, but true authority was something entirely different. It came not from the uniform or the badge, but from wisdom, patience, and the courage to act with fairness. Harold hoped quietly that the officer would see this. He remembered the brief moment when the officer had read his name and paused. That pause had carried more weight than any words. For a split second, the officer had seen beyond appearances and realized that assumptions could be misleading. Harold did not wish to humiliate or lecture him. Instead, he wished for understanding. Sometimes the most important lessons were not taught in courtrooms or schools, but in the simplest exchanges between people. Harold rose from his chair and walked to the window, gazing out at the quiet street. The neighborhood bathed in soft moonlight seemed peaceful again. He thought about how ordinary life could hold extraordinary lessons if people were willing to pause and notice. The evening had reminded him of the many times he had faced injustice, not only for himself but for others. It was one of those moments that made him realize the work of justice and patience never truly ended. It continued in subtle ways. Long after the public accolades or courtroom rulings faded, he smiled faintly, thinking about the young students he had addressed earlier in the day. Their bright eyes, their curiosity, and their eagerness to learn reminded him why he had chosen to dedicate his life to the law and to teaching others. Tonight had been another lesson he could someday share with them, not just about legal principles, but about human nature, dignity, and the quiet strength that comes from standing firm in one's values. After a few moments, Harold set his cup down and sat back in his armchair, letting the calm of the night settle around him. He reflected on the subtle irony of the encounter. A Supreme Court judge, a person whose decisions shaped lives across the nation, had been judged momentarily by a young officer who did not know his identity. It was a striking reminder that no one was immune to assumptions and that true character showed most clearly not in moments of recognition, but in moments of challenge. Harold's thoughts shifted to the future. He hoped the officer would remember this encounter, not with embarrassment, but with insight. Perhaps it would influence the way he approached people, the way he made judgments, and the way he understood his own responsibility. Harold knew that reflection often took time. Lessons planted gently could grow quietly, transforming attitudes and actions in ways that would only become apparent later. The night carried on, and Harold found himself thinking about the broader lessons of life. How often did people act too quickly, relying on appearances rather than facts? How many conflicts might be avoided if patience, understanding, and humility were practiced more widely? He thought about how much power there was in a calm presence, a measured response, and a refusal to let assumptions dictate behavior. Tonight had been a small, but meaningful demonstration of these principles. Harold returned to his desk, opening his notebook once more. He began to write, recording his reflections from the evening. He wrote about patience, about the quiet authority of fairness, and about the unexpected ways life could reveal lessons. He noted that every person, regardless of age, background, or title, had the capacity to teach and to learn. He wrote about the subtle impact of dignity, of facing challenges without anger, and of embodying principles even when no one else recognized them. The words flowed easily, as if they had been waiting for him to give them form. Harold wrote about the power of example, of showing others what it meant to act with integrity, and of how moments that might seem small could carry lessons far beyond the immediate context. He reflected on how much he had learned in his own life from encounters that had seemed ordinary at the time, but had become defining moments in retrospect. He paused to sip his tea again, savoring the warmth and the quiet. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves in the trees, and the occasional distant sound of a car reminded him that life continued beyond the walls of his home. Yet in that moment he felt a sense of fulfillment. The evening, with all its unexpected twists, had ended peacefully. No one had been hurt, no conflict had escalated, yet the truth had spoken quietly and clearly. Harold thought about how the officer would reflect on this night in the days and months ahead. Perhaps he would remember the calmness, the patience, and the dignity that Harold had shown. Perhaps he would recognize that authority was most meaningful when tempered with fairness and understanding. Harold trusted that the young officer had learned something important, even if it was only slowly, over time. He rose from his chair and walked to the living room window again, looking out at the quiet neighborhood. The houses were dark, the streets empty, and the night still. He felt a sense of completion, knowing that the events of this evening had resolved not with confrontation, but with reflection and respect. He had upheld the values he had lived by for decades, and that in itself was a small victory for the kind of justice and integrity he believed in. Harold thought once more about the students, the young people who looked up to him, and the responsibility he carried to guide them. Life was full of moments like this one, moments that tested patience, character, and the ability to act rightly even when unrecognized. He hoped that by living consistently with these principles, he could continue to influence others positively, planting seeds of understanding, compassion, and fairness wherever he went. The night slowly passed, the soft glow of the moon tracing shadows across the walls. Harold finished his tea and placed the cup on the table. He leaned back, letting his thoughts settle, feeling a quiet satisfaction that came not from recognition but from alignment with his own values. Life had tested him in a small but meaningful way, and he had responded as he always had, with patience, dignity, and calm confidence. As he prepared to retire for the night, Harold reflected one last time on the lessons of the evening. He understood that every interaction, no matter how brief, carried the potential to teach or to learn. Even the simplest moments could become powerful reminders of the importance of integrity, patience, and respect for others. The roadside encounter would remain with him, not as a source of anger or frustration, but as a testament to the quiet strength of living according to one's principles. Finally, Harold turned off the lamp, the room settling into darkness, and made his way to bed. The night was silent, and the world outside continued on as it always did. Yet inside, Harold carried a sense of peace, a quiet knowledge that he had faced life's small challenge with the values he held dear, and that in doing so, he had not only preserved his own dignity, but had quietly sown a seed of understanding that might grow in someone else's heart. In that stillness, Harold realized that the true measure of a person was not in titles or recognition, but in how they responded to the ordinary moments that life presented. It was in patience, humility, and quiet strength. It was in the choices made when no one was watching, in the ability to meet life with fairness and dignity, even when assumptions and judgments threatened to cloud the moment. The night passed peacefully, and Harold slept, carrying with him the knowledge that life had once again affirmed his belief. That patience, respect, and quiet courage were the greatest forms of influence one could offer in the world, and in the quiet reflection of dawn yet to come, he knew that the lessons of the evening would ripple outward, beyond himself, touching lives in ways unseen but deeply meaningful.